I have been a ledger warden for 31 years. That is not a boast. In the Sorvith Cataloging Collective, 31 years at a classification station is not a career worth celebrating. It is simply a number, logged in the personnel ledger alongside my designation, my shift rotation, my dietary allocations, and the 17 minor commendations I have received for accurate mass estimation in contested boundary sectors. I do not mention the years to impress you. I mention them because they are the context you need to understand what happened on the night of the boundary crossing, and why I am the one writing this account rather than one of the 342 other personnel who were aboard Meridian 9 when the contact appeared. I am writing it because I am the one who saw it first. I am writing it because I am, so far as anyone can determine, the one who was paying attention when the ledger stopped working. My name is Sale Myron. I hold the rank of Senior Classification Warden, 3rd Tier, assigned to Meridian 9 Survey and Boundary Station, Outer Reach Sector 14. My station is positioned at the boundary between collective catalogued space and the region we designate the uncatalogued fringe. A vast volume of interstellar territory that our survey vessels have not yet fully mapped, that our ledger has not yet fully resolved, and that, according to official collective doctrine, does not exist in any meaningful sense. Let me explain what that means, because it matters. The Sorvith Cataloging Collective classifies everything. This is not a figure of speech. In 4,211 years of continuous operation, the collective's ledger has processed, categorized, and filed every object, vessel, entity, and phenomenon we have encountered. Every asteroid above 3 meters in diameter, every biological organism above the cellular threshold, every ship, military, civilian, survey, derelict, active, dormant, disassembled that has crossed our sensors, every signal, every anomaly, everything. The ledger has 4.7 trillion entries. The classification system has 17 primary categories, 209 subcategories, and 41,006 individual object type designations. When a new contact appears on our sensors, the ledger processes it against all known entries within approximately 0.4 seconds. If the contact matches an existing entry, it is resolved, assigned to its category, logged, filed, and removed from active monitoring. If it does not match, the ledger generates a provisional classification within a further 1.2 seconds, drawing on the contact's mass, velocity, energy signature, spectral profile, and origin vector to assign it the closest matching designation. In 4,211 years, the ledger has failed to generate a provisional classification exactly twice. The first time was during the Orcs anomaly, 600 years ago, when a spatial distortion of unknown origin passed through Sector 7 and briefly registered as an object before dissipating. The ledger eventually classified it as a Category 7 atmospheric phenomenon of unusual geometry. The resolution took 14 minutes. It remains the longest unresolved contact in the collective's history. It remained the longest unresolved contact until the night of the boundary crossing. I was on duty at 3:40 station time when the boundary sensor array emitted the alert. I want to be precise about the time because precision is what I do. I log everything. I have logged everything for 31 years. The alert came at 340.17 station time, and I noted it in my duty log within 4 seconds of receiving it, as protocol requires. The alert tone was a single low pulse, the tone reserved for unclassified contacts above the mass threshold, not an emergency tone, not an intrusion alarm, simply the tone that says, something is here and the ledger has not yet resolved it. I receive perhaps 6 such alerts per month. They were, without exception, resolved within the ledger's standard 1.6 second window, asteroids on unusual trajectories, derelict hulls drifting in from the fringe, survey vessels from neighboring sectors that had neglected to transmit their registry codes ahead of their approach. Routine. I pulled up the contact on my console. The mass reading stopped me. In 31 years of classification work, I have encountered objects of every scale. I have cataloged gas giants and their moons. I have processed the contact data for the collective's largest military vessels, the archive carriers, which run at 1.8 kilometers in length and are the biggest artificial objects the ledger has ever been required to classify. I know what large looks like on a sensor console. This contact was larger than any archive carrier. The initial mass estimate put it at approximately 2.4 kilometers in length, with a cross-section consistent with an artificial structure of considerable internal volume. The reading refreshed 3 times in the first 4 seconds, each time returning the same figure within acceptable variance. My console's display had a scale indicator in the lower left corner, a small amber bar that filled from left to right as object mass increased. In 31 years, I had never seen it fill more than 70% of its range. It was reading full. I keyed the ledger resolution query manually, as protocol requires for any contact above the mass alert threshold. The system acknowledged the query. The processing indicator lit. I waited. At 1.6 seconds, the provisional classification should have appeared. At 3 seconds, I was still looking at the processing indicator. At 6 seconds, I called my secondary console and ran the query again, assuming a sensor error. At 14 seconds, both queries were still processing. I sat very still for a moment. Then I opened the duty log and entered 340.31, unclassified boundary contact, mass above archive carrier threshold. Ledger resolution delayed beyond standard parameters, initiating extended query protocol. What I did not write, what I could not write in a duty log, because duty logs are formal documents that feed directly into the personnel ledger and are reviewed by senior staff on a weekly cycle, was what I was actually thinking. What I was actually thinking was that I had never seen the ledger take longer than 14 minutes, and that had been a spatial anomaly, and this was not a spatial anomaly. This was a solid contact with a coherent mass signature and an internal energy reading that was rising steadily as I watched. The object was not drifting, it was under power. At 3:47 station time, 6 minutes and 43 seconds after the initial alert, I escalated the contact to duty supervisor level. The duty supervisor that night was Warden 2nd Palatsev Karan, a reliable officer with 22 years of service and an impeccable classification record. She arrived at my station within 90 seconds of receiving the escalation signal, reviewed my console data, and said nothing for approximately 8 seconds. Then she said, "Run it again." "I've run it 11 times, I told her. She looked at the processing indicator, which was still cycling. "The ledger is still processing." "Yes." "For how long?" 7 minutes and 12 seconds, as of now." Another silence. I watched her run through the same sequence of assumptions I had already exhausted: sensor error, data corruption, network fault, query malfunction. I watched her reach the same end state I had reached, which is the end state you arrive at when all the technical explanations have been eliminated, and what remains is simply the data itself. The data itself said, something 2.4 kilometers long, running under active power, was crossing the boundary into collective space, and the ledger had no category for it. "Get the prime arbiter," Palatsev Karan said. "It's 3:47, I said. "Get the prime arbiter." I sent the escalation signal. While we waited, I continued monitoring the contact. The data was building with each sensor refresh, and what it was building into was not reassuring. The contact's velocity was steady, not accelerating, not decelerating, simply moving at a fixed rate that my console's nav calculation module flagged as inconsistent with any known propulsion classification. Not ion drive, not mass displacement, not the gravitic fold drives that the collective's own military vessels used. The energy signature from the contact's aft section was consistent with a drive system, but the pattern was not in the ledger's propulsion type database. At 3:51, I picked up the first thermal data from the contact's hull surface. The hull was hot, not from combat damage, not from atmospheric entry. The heat pattern was consistent with a long dormancy followed by a rapid power-up. The kind of heat you get when something very large, very cold, and very old turns its systems back on after an extended period of inactivity. Whatever this was, it had been off for a long time. And now it was on. And it was moving toward us. Prime Arbiter Vorath Sendisik arrived at the monitoring deck at 3:58, and I will say this for her. She did not question the escalation. She looked at my console for perhaps 45 seconds, asked me 2 questions. How long had the ledger been processing? And had I detected any signal emission from the contact? And then she pulled up the station's full sensor array on the main display board and looked at the contact data with the expression of someone who has spent 40 years in the collective's classification service and has just encountered something that does not fit. It is a particular expression. I recognized it because I had been wearing it for 18 minutes. No signal emissions, she asked again. None, no hail, no transponder, no automated registry broadcast, nothing. It's running completely silent. Yes. She studied the mass readings, 2.4 kilometers. Best estimate. The ledger's mass resolution module is still processing. It is still processing the primary classification query, she said. This was not a question. She was reading from my console. Yes, Prime Arbiter. She was quiet for a moment, then contacted. I broadcast the standard collective hail on all registered frequencies, the 17-band greeting protocol that opens every interspecies communication exchange, followed by the 3-tone classification request that legally requires any vessel in collective adjacent space to transmit its registry data. The hail went out at 400.09 station time. No response. I sent it again at 4:01. No response. I switched to the emergency contact frequency, the broad-spectrum pulse that the collective uses for vessels in distress or operating with damaged communication systems. The pulse could be detected by any vessel with functioning sensors within a range of approximately 40 light minutes. No response. At 4:04, the contact crossed the boundary. I do not mean it entered a warning zone or triggered a secondary alert threshold. I mean it crossed the physical boundary marker, the network of relay buoys that the collective maintains at the precise edge of catalogued space, marking the line between the known and the unresolved. Every vessel that crosses that line is required by collective law to transmit registry data within 60 seconds of crossing. The contact crossed the boundary and continued inward at the same heading and the same velocity, silent, without any registry transmission, without any acknowledgement of our hails. It crossed our boundary as though our boundary did not exist. As though we did not exist. At 4:09, the ledger's classification engine returned its first substantive output in 29 minutes of processing. It was not a classification, it was an error state. In 31 years of classification work, I had seen the ledger return error states perhaps a dozen times. They were always the same 3 types: data insufficient, not enough sensor information to classify, data corrupt, sensor malfunction producing unreadable input, or category pending, a genuinely novel contact type requiring manual review and the creation of a new subcategory. I had personally submitted 4 category pending requests in my career, 3 of which had resulted in new ledger entries. This was none of those 3 types. The error code the ledger returned was one I did not recognize. The designation string was long, 47 characters, which was unusual. Standard error codes ran to 12 or fewer, and when I cross-referenced it against the ledger's internal error code registry, the system returned designation not found in error code database. The ledger had returned an error code that was not in the ledger. I stared at that for a long time. Then I did something I had never done in 31 years of service. I opened a raw data terminal, the kind of direct interface that bypasses the ledger's display formatting and shows you the underlying classification engine output, unprocessed, in the system's native data notation. It is a tool that exists for diagnostic purposes and is almost never used because the raw output is not designed for biological reading. It is the ledger talking to itself, in a notation that assumes you already know the system's internal logic at a level that requires years of specialist training to parse. I have years of specialist training. I parsed it. It took me 11 minutes. What I read when I had parsed it was this. The ledger's classification engine had processed the contact data against all 4.7 trillion entries. It had found no match. It had then run the provisional classification algorithm, which is designed to generate a best fit designation for any object, regardless of how unusual. The algorithm had run to completion. It had produced a provisional designation. The provisional designation was null. Not an empty field null. A mathematical null, a designation that in the ledger's internal logic means this value cannot exist within the current operational framework. The classification engine was not saying it could not find the right category. It was saying that the category itself, the entire conceptual space in which this object should exist, was not in the ledger. The Sorvith Collective has 41,006 individual object type designations. The ledger was saying that this object was none of them, not close to any of them, not in the neighborhood of any of them. It was saying that whatever was 2.4 kilometers long, running hot across 12 discrete energy emission bands, crossing into collective space on a fixed heading, was something for which the collective's 4,000-year classification history had no framework at all. I wrote in my duty log, 420, ledger returns null provisional classification, no precedent found, requesting immediate senior review. What I was thinking was considerably less composed than that. At 426, Prime Arbiter Voreth Sendisik ordered a full active scan. I want to be clear about what that means. Meridian 9 is a survey and boundary station, not a military installation. Our sensor suite is designed for the kind of deep, patient, high-resolution observation that classification work requires, not for the kind of rapid tactical sweep that a warship's sensors would produce. A full active scan from our array takes approximately 4 minutes to complete and produces a data package that is, in classification terms, extraordinarily detailed. We had been running passive sensors on the contact since 340. Passive sensors give you mass, velocity, energy signature, and rough dimensional profile. They tell you how big something is and how fast it is moving. They do not tell you what it looks like. The active scan tells you what it looks like. I initiated the scan at 426.14. The 4-minute window began. While the scan ran, I continued monitoring the contact's progress. It was now approximately 0.7 light hours inside the boundary, moving at a velocity that would bring it to Meridian 9's position in approximately 9 hours if it maintained heading and speed. The energy readings from its drive section had stabilized, which meant it was no longer in the power-up phase. Its systems were fully active. At 430.14, the scan completed. The data package arrived at my console in 0.003 seconds. It is always fast. The sensors are good at their job. The rendering, however, the process by which raw sensor data is converted into a display image, took 6 seconds longer than normal. When it rendered, I understood why it had taken longer. The image that appeared on my console display was the highest resolution external scan of an artificial structure I had seen in 31 years of classification work. It was a warship. I do not use that word lightly or imprecisely. In 31 years, I have classified thousands of vessels, including military vessels of every type in the collective's records, and the records of every species the collective has encountered in 4,000 years. I know what a warship looks like. I know the design language, the reinforced hull plating, the weapons arrays, the drive configuration that prioritizes power delivery over efficiency, the sensor baffles, the point defense emplacements, the hardened crew sections set deep in the hull away from the outer skin. This was a warship, every line of it. It was enormous. At 2.4 kilometers, it was a third again larger than our largest archive carrier, and where archive carriers are built for volume, wide, blocky, designed to carry hundreds of thousands of tons of cataloged material, this ship was built for something else entirely. It was long and dense, its profile low-slung along the horizontal axis with a pronounced bow that narrowed to a reinforced ram point, its flanks lined with weapons emplacements in 2 staggered rows running the full length of the hull. I counted 47 primary emplacements on the port side alone. Each one appeared to be intact. The hull itself was extraordinary. It was not clean. It was not new. It was covered in the kind of accumulated damage and repair work that speaks of centuries of active service, scored by particle impacts, patched with hull plating of subtly different alloy compositions, marked by the discoloration of repeated atmospheric entry and re-entry, scarred across its bow section by what appeared to be the residue of a weapon impact that had been sealed but never fully refinished. The paint, if it had ever been painted, was gone from most of the hull, leaving bare metal that had oxidized in bands of gray and amber and deep rust brown. It looked ancient. It looked like it had been through things I did not have the data to imagine. And it was still here, still running, every weapon's emplacement powered, every sensor array active. 12 distinct energy emission bands running simultaneously, consistent with the full operational load of a vessel whose systems were not on standby but on ready. Ready for what? I did not allow myself to finish thinking. I found the hull markings at 433. They were on the bow section, forward of the weapons array. A designation, in a script I did not immediately recognize, applied in large characters that the scan's resolution was sufficient to read clearly. I ran the script through the ledger's linguistic database. The ledger resolved it in 0.9 seconds. The script was a variant of a Terran Latin-derived writing system, modified by approximately 6 centuries of typographic drift. The designation on the bow of the warship read, in the collective standard rendering, ISV Iridian scar. I ran ISV through the database. The ledger returned designation prefix, probable affiliation, Terran Interstellar Vessel Registry System status, ledger entry C cross-reference. I opened the cross-reference. The cross-reference entry was 847 years old. Let me tell you what the collective knows about Terra. What the collective knows about Terra is what the ledger contains, and the ledger contains what our survey vessels have collected over the centuries, which is, given the distance, and the historical priorities of the collective's survey program, and certain operational decisions made by previous prime arbiters that I do not have the standing to critique, not much. The entry for Terra in the Civilization Ledger, the subdatabase that classifies intelligent species and their associated polities, is 847 years old. It was compiled by the Survey Vessel Accurate Record during its mapping pass of a distant spiral arm, and it is, by the standards of a proper ledger entry, sparse. It notes the existence of a species of bilaterally symmetrical bipeds on a Class M world at the coordinates listed. It notes that the species had achieved faster-than-light travel capability at the time of survey. It notes that the species maintained a military fleet of unknown size and composition. The survey vessel had detected active military energy signatures, but had not conducted a close approach for safety reasons, and that the species appeared to be in a period of significant expansion along several vectors. It notes that no formal contact had been made. It notes that the entry should be considered preliminary and subject to revision upon further survey. The further survey had not happened. 847 years had passed, and the collective had not sent another survey vessel to that sector, because the sector was distant, and the collective survey priorities are determined by the Classification Council, and the Classification Council had not, in 847 years, moved that sector to the top of the list. So we had an 847-year-old note that said, "Species exists, has FTL, has a military, no contact made." We had no ship registry entries. We had no vessel specifications. We had no classification data on their military hardware. The Iridian scar did not appear in the ledger because we had never catalogued it. We had never catalogued it because we had never been close enough to any Terran military vessel to scan it. We had never been close enough because, and I am reading this from the survey vessel's own notes, filed 847 years ago, the survey officer had assessed the species' military posture and decided that a close approach to their vessels was inadvisable. 847 years ago, one of our own survey officers had seen the Terrans at range and decided not to get closer. I sat with that for a moment. Then I looked at the image on my console, at the 2.4-kilometer hull, at the 47 portside weapons emplacements, at the ancient scarred bowplate, at the drive emissions that were running at what I estimated to be approximately 60% of maximum output, which meant the ship had significant power in reserve. And I thought about what it must have looked like to that survey officer 847 years ago, seen at range, and I understood the decision. At 4:41, I brought the full scan data to Prime Arbiter Voreth Sendisik. I showed her the hull designation. I showed her the ledger cross-reference. I showed her the 847-year-old survey note. She read it twice. Then she looked at the scan image for a long time, at the hull, at the emplacements, at the drive configuration, with the expression of someone revising a large number of prior assumptions simultaneously. "It's a Terran vessel," she said. "That is the best available conclusion, yes. And we have no registry entry for it. We have no registry entries for any Terran military vessels. The survey note predates any formal contact or classification. How long has it been in our space?" I checked the tracking log. 1 hour and 3 minutes since boundary crossing, Prime Arbiter. She was quiet. Outside the monitoring deck's observation window, Meridian 9 had a physical window, which is unusual in collective stations, but was a design feature of the Outer Reach series. I could see the stars, clear and still and utterly indifferent. "What is its heading?" she asked. I had already run the nav projection. I had run it 3 times, hoping I had made a calculation error, and 3 times I had gotten the same result. "If it maintains current heading and velocity," I said, "it is on a direct approach vector for the collective's home system." She looked at me. "Passing through," I added, "or heading to. The nav data cannot distinguish between the two." Another silence, a long one. "We have had no provocation," she said finally. This was not quite a statement. It was the thing she was telling herself. "No formal contact has ever been made with the Terran polity," I agreed. "There is no record of any provocation." "Then why is it here?" I did not have an answer. I looked at the scan image, at the 47 emplacements, at the ancient hull, at the ship that had been somewhere doing something for 847 years since we last noted the species' existence, and decided not to get closer. I don't know, I said. At 500, Prime Arbiter Voreth Sendisik transmitted to the Classification Council. I was not in the room for that transmission. Senior wardens are not present at Prime Arbiter level communications. I know what the transmission said because I was given access to the transcript later, as part of the formal incident review, and I have read it many times since. The transmission was precise and accurate. She reported the contact. She reported the mass and dimensions. She reported the null classification result. She reported the Terran identification from the hull designation. She reported the heading and the estimated time of arrival at collective core space if the vessel maintained its course. She reported that the vessel had not responded to hails on any frequency. She reported that the vessel had crossed the boundary without acknowledging it. She reported that the vessel was moving without deviation, without response, without any acknowledgement that the collective space or the collective stations or the collective itself existed. The Classification Council's response arrived 40 minutes later. It contained 2 directives. The first directive ordered Meridian 9 to continue hailing the vessel on all frequencies and to make every effort to establish contact. The second directive ordered the Prime Arbiter to initiate the Boundary Closure Protocol. The Boundary Closure Protocol is the collective's highest-level territorial assertion tool. It is a broad-spectrum signal emission that broadcasts on all frequencies simultaneously, in a pattern that is recognized by every species in the collective's contact database as meaning, without ambiguity. You have entered sovereign collective space without authorization. Halt your approach and await processing, or you will be considered hostile. In 4,211 years, the Boundary Closure Protocol had been used 37 times. In 37 uses, it had never failed to produce compliance. Every vessel, every fleet, every convoy, every probe, every uninvited presence that had ever received the Boundary Closure Protocol had halted and awaited processing. Prime Arbiter Voreth Sendisik initiated it at 5:43 station time. The Iridian Scar did not halt. I was at my console when the closure protocol went out, and I watched the contact data in the minutes that followed with the kind of attention that makes your eyes ache, because you are not allowing yourself to blink. The protocol takes approximately 12 seconds to reach a vessel at the contact's current range. I counted 12 seconds from transmission. Then I watched for the velocity change, the deceleration signature that every vessel produces when it receives the protocol and complies. At 12 seconds, there was no velocity change. At 15 seconds, there was no velocity change. At 20 seconds, there was no velocity change. The Iridian Scar was not slowing. It was not turning. It was not altering any parameter of its approach. The drive emissions were steady. The heading was unchanged. The velocity was identical to the figure I had recorded at 3:40 when I first saw it on my console. The ship had received the protocol. It had to have received it at that range on that signal strength, and it had done nothing. It had received our highest territorial authority signal, the thing that had stopped 37 alien vessels in 4,000 years, and it had simply continued. At 5:48, Warden Second Pilot Sevkaran came to my console and stood beside me for a while without speaking. Then she said, "Is it possible it didn't receive it?" "No," I said. She looked at the contact data, at the unchanged velocity, at the unchanged heading. "It received it and ignored it," she said. "Yes." She was quiet for a long time. Outside the window, the stars were still there, still clear and still and utterly indifferent. "What does that mean?" she asked. I thought about what it meant. I thought about 847 years. I thought about the survey officer who had seen this species at range and decided not to get closer. I thought about the 47 emplacements on the port side alone. I thought about the fact that we had not made formal contact in 847 years, and this ship was now inside our space on a heading for our home system, and it was not stopping. I think it means, I said carefully, that we are not a factor in its calculations. At 600, I sent a personal message to my family on the home world. I am noting this because it is in the station's communications log, and the incident review will find it if they look, and I would rather explain it myself. The message was brief. It did not contain any classified information. It said that I was well and that I was thinking of them and that I was very glad they were there. The communication protocols at Meridian 9 operate on a 6-hour cycle, so the message would not be transmitted until 600 anyway. It was already 600.01 when I queued it. I am not trying to suggest I was afraid. I am trying to be accurate. Accuracy is my profession. And accurately, I thought about my family at 600 and I sent them a message. At 700, the Prime Arbiter ordered the station to begin evacuation procedures. Not a full evacuation, a partial one, prioritizing non-essential personnel and the physical data archive that Meridian 9 maintained as a backup to the main ledger. Essential monitoring personnel, including myself, were to remain at stations. The evacuation transports were loaded by 8:30. By 8:45, they were away from the station and moving outward, toward the boundary and the open space beyond it. I watched them on the secondary display, small bright points moving steadily away from us. I watched them and I noted, for the third time in 8 hours, that the Iridian scar had not changed course, had not changed speed, had not done anything at all except continue its approach. At 900, the contact was approximately 3.2 light hours inside the boundary. The nav projection still showed it on the direct line for the home system. The estimated transit time to the outermost collective inhabited world, if it maintained speed, was now 31 hours. At 9:30, the Prime Arbiter made one final attempt at contact. She broadcast on every frequency the station could produce, simultaneously in the collective's 17 principal diplomatic languages and in the Terran language script that the ledger had cross-referenced from the hull designation. She identified Meridian 9. She identified herself. She stated the collective's name and its boundaries. She asked plainly for the vessel to halt and respond. The broadcast went out at 930.07. There was a long silence. Then, at 931.14, 1 minute and 7 seconds after the broadcast, the Iridian scar transmitted. It was a single-burst transmission, narrowband, on a frequency we had not been monitoring because it was not in our diplomatic communication registry. I caught it on the wideband passive array, and it took me 40 seconds to isolate it and run it through the ledger's signal processing module. It was an audio transmission, not a data packet, not a coded signal. An audio transmission meaning it was designed to be listened to in real time by biological ears. It lasted 4 seconds. The signal processing module rendered it as a waveform, and then the linguistic database processed the waveform, and the linguistic database matched it to the Terran language variant in its cross-reference, and it produced a translation. The translation was 3 words. I read the 3 words. Then I sat back in my chair and I looked at the scan image on my console, at the 2.4-kilometer hull, at the 47 emplacements, at the ancient scarred bowplate, and I thought about the 3 words for quite a long time. The 3 words were, "We know, continue." I have spent a great deal of time, since the night of the boundary crossing, trying to determine what those 3 words meant. We know meaning what? That they knew we were there, that they knew we had broadcast. That they were aware of our existence, our station, our protocols, the closure protocol, the hails, the scan, all of it. Yes, all of that clearly. They had been receiving everything we transmitted since 400. They knew. Continue meaning what? That we should continue what we were doing. That the station should continue operating. That the Iridian scar would continue its approach regardless. Or some combination of all of these, an acknowledgement that was simultaneously a dismissal, a reassurance that was simultaneously a statement of absolute indifference. I could not resolve it. The ledger could not resolve it. I filed a formal interpretation request, and the Linguistic Subcommittee of the Classification Council returned a finding of ambiguous, insufficient context for definitive translation. 3 words, and the best minds in the collective's language division could not tell me with certainty what they meant. What I believe now, writing this account, is that the 3 words meant exactly what they appeared to mean at face value, and that the ambiguity was not in the words themselves, but in the assumption I was bringing to them. I was assuming that the transmission was addressed to us, that we referred to the ship's crew, or the Terran polity, or the Iridian scar specifically, and that continue was an instruction to us. I am no longer certain that is what the transmission was. I think now that the transmission was not addressed to us at all. I think it was addressed to somewhere else, to wherever it was going, to whoever it was reporting to, in a communication we happened to intercept. I think we know meant we are aware of the station and have logged the contact. I think continue meant we will continue on our current heading as planned. I think the Iridian scar transmitted a routine status update to its command authority, and we happen to be in the way of the signal. That possibility is, in some ways, more unsettling than any of the others. At 1100, one of my junior wardens, Warden 3rd Osith New Palak, who had been assigned to track the contact's energy output data since 600, came to me with a finding. The finding was this: the Iridian scar's weapons emplacements were not powered to their current level because they were preparing to fire. They were powered to their current level because they were on standard ready-state maintenance charge, the kind of charge you maintain when you are transiting through space and you want your weapon systems functional but not at fire-ready temperature. Ready state, not fire-ready, not standby, not powered down. The distinction, in military hardware terminology, is approximately the difference between holding a rifle at the carry position and holding it at the ready position. It is armed, it is functional, it is not in this precise moment being aimed at anything. But it is not being put down. I noted this in my duty log and brought it to the Prime Arbiter. She looked at the data for a moment and then said, quietly, "It's not here for us." No, I agreed. It doesn't know we're a threat. I thought about that phrasing. Not, it doesn't consider us a threat. Not, it has assessed us and found us non-threatening. But, it doesn't know we're a threat. Meaning the question of whether we were a threat had not been entered into its calculations at all. We were not something that had been evaluated and dismissed. We were something that had not been evaluated because the evaluation had not been deemed necessary. A vessel 2.4 kilometers long with 47 portside weapons emplacements at ready-state maintenance charge had crossed into our space, received our most powerful territorial assertion signal, been scanned at high resolution, been hailed on every available frequency, and it had not found any of this worth putting its weapons on fire ready for. "What is it here for?" the Prime Arbiter asked. "I don't know," I said, "but it's going somewhere." At 1300, I submitted a formal request to the Classification Council to create a new ledger entry for the Iridian scar. This was procedurally correct. In the absence of a provisional classification, the standing protocol requires the supervising warden to prepare a manual entry. I compiled everything we had: the hull designation, the dimensional data, the energy signature, the drive configuration analysis, the weapons emplacement count, the hull material spectrographic data, the transmission recording and translation. I assigned it a preliminary object type designation under the category Unresolved Artificial Structure, Active Military Function Probable. This was the loosest available classification. Essentially, a flag in the ledger that says this exists and we do not know what it is. The request was automatically forwarded to the Classification Council's Emergency Review Committee. The Emergency Review Committee sent back an acknowledgement at 1340. The acknowledgement contained a single line, entry under review, classification pending. Classification pending. The same notation the ledger had returned to me at 420, rendered now in formal council language and stamped with 3 authorization codes. In 4,211 years of continuous operation, the collective's ledger had one item classified as pending. 1. The Iridian scar. At 1600, the Iridian scar passed Meridian 9. Not close, it was not on a direct intercept with the station, and I had confirmed many hours earlier that its heading was not aimed at us. But it passed us, in the sense that we were now behind it instead of ahead of it, and the distance at closest approach was approximately 0.3 light hours, which in interstellar terms is very close, and in the practical terms of a station crew watching it on sensors is present. Undeniably, enormously present. At closest approach, I ran another full active scan. The data package took it 6 seconds to render. When it rendered, I could see details I had not been able to resolve at the earlier range. The hull weathering was extensive, scoring from particle impacts that, by the depth and oxide layering, were centuries old, patches of hull plating in at least 14 distinct alloy compositions, each one laid over the original hull material at a different point in the ship's service life, by repair crews who had used whatever was available rather than matching the original specification. Discoloration bands running diagonally across the bow section, consistent with multiple re-entries through planetary atmospheres over a very long period. The bow itself, the ram point, the forward tip of the hull that you aim at things when you intend to make a very direct point, was clear. No damage markings, no oxidation. The metal there was polished in contrast to everything behind it, to the dull shine of something that has been maintained specifically and recently. I looked at that for a long time. You maintain something for a purpose. You do not polish a ram point because it looks nice. You polish it because you use it and you intend to keep using it, and the maintenance matters. The Iridian scar had been through a very great deal. Its hull said so in every scoring and patch and discoloration band, and it had come out the other side of a very great deal with its ram point maintained. At 1618, as I was completing the scan analysis, Warden 3rd Oseth New Palak came to my console and said, "Warden Senior, there's something you should see in the thermal data." I looked at what he had found. Along the hull, in the spaces between the weapons emplacements, in the long dark stretches of plating that I had assumed were simply hull structure, there were thermal signatures, small, discrete, irregular, not the signature of machinery, not the signature of power conduits or coolant lines. The signature of biological organisms. Living things inside the hull in the spaces between the guns, moving around because biological thermal signatures are not static, they fluctuate with activity. There were clusters of them in what I estimated were crew habitation areas. Smaller clusters in what might have been operation spaces. Individual signatures moving between areas through what I assumed were internal corridors. There were a great many of them. I ran an estimate. Based on hull volume, the number of discrete thermal signatures, and the distribution pattern, the ledger's biological survey module produced a crew estimate. The estimate was between 14,000 and 19,000 individual biological organisms on a single ship. I sat with that number for a while. Then I looked at the scan image again, at the 2.4 kilometers of hull, at the 47 emplacements per side, at the ancient scarring and the maintained ram point. And I thought about what you build a ship to carry 14,000 to 19,000 people across an interstellar distance. And I thought about the fact that this was apparently one ship, not a fleet, just one. And I thought about the 847-year-old survey note that said the species maintained a military fleet of unknown size and composition. Unknown size. Unknown composition. One ship, unknown size fleet. I made a note in my duty log. The note said, request priority resurvey of Terran system and surrounding sectors at earliest classification council opportunity. I did not expect the note to result in a survey. I wrote it anyway. At 1900, 6 hours and 17 minutes after the Iridian Scar had crossed the boundary, Prime Arbiter Voreth Sendisik gathered the remaining station staff, 47 of us, the essential monitoring complement, in the main assembly space and spoke to us. She told us what we already knew, because all 47 of us had been watching the same sensor data for the same length of time and had arrived at the same understanding. She confirmed the heading. She confirmed the contact's continued silence. She confirmed the Classification Council's directives, which had been updated at 1830 to include a system-wide advisory to all collective military assets. An advisory that I will note here was somewhat academic, given that the Iridian Scar would reach the nearest collective military patrol zone in approximately 23 hours, and the nearest concentration of collective military assets in approximately 36 hours. She told us there was nothing further Meridian 9 could do. Then she said something that has stayed with me. She said, we have operated on the assumption for 4,000 years that our ledger contains a sufficient representation of reality, that everything significant, everything we needed to know about, was in the record. We maintained the boundary at Sector 14 because the surveys told us there was nothing beyond it that required immediate attention. She paused. The surveys were not wrong exactly, but they were incomplete, and the gap in the record, the space between what the ledger contained and what was actually there, was not empty. She let that settle. Then she said, file your observations accurately. The record must reflect what happened here. We went back to our stations. At 2100, the Iridian Scar transmitted again. Another narrowband burst, another 4-second audio clip on the same frequency as the first transmission. We were monitoring that frequency now. The signal processing module rendered it in approximately 20 seconds. The translation was longer this time. 11 words. Meridian 9 survey station logged, proceeding on assigned heading. Estimated arrival at coordinates 31 hours. Logged. The Iridian Scar had logged us. It had encountered our station, received our hails, received our closure protocol, been scanned by us at high resolution, and it had logged us, put us in its record, filed us under whatever designation its own system used for things encountered along the way. We had spent 12 hours attempting to classify it. It had spent 12 hours noting our existence and moving on. I do not know whether to find that humbling or clarifying. I have decided, after considerable reflection, that it is both. At 2300, I completed my duty log entry for the day. It is the longest duty log entry in Meridian 9's operational history. I know this because I checked, and the previous longest entry was submitted in year 3847 of the collective calendar by a warden named Veth Po Sanark, who had been on duty during the Orcs anomaly and had logged 14 pages of observations about the spatial distortion and the ledger's resolution process. My entry is 22 pages. I filed it at 2318 and I sat at my console for a while after filing it, watching the contact data. The Iridian scar was now well past Meridian 9, moving deeper into collective space at the same steady velocity. The drive emissions were unchanged. The weapons emplacements were unchanged, still at ready-state maintenance charge. The heading was unchanged. Everything was unchanged. That was the thing that I kept returning to, in the quiet of the monitoring deck at 2318 with 47 colleagues at their stations, and the evacuation transports somewhere far behind us, and the contact moving steadily away. Everything was unchanged. It had been unchanged from the moment I first saw it on my console at 340. No deviation. No response to our hails that altered its behavior. No response to our protocol that altered its course. No response to our scans, our transmissions, our existence. It had arrived with a heading and a velocity, and it had maintained them, and it was going to continue maintaining them until it arrived at wherever it was going. The collective had not been a factor. Our space had not been a factor. The entire apparatus of 4,000 years of classification, of boundary maintenance, of territorial assertion, none of it had been a factor. And the ship was not hostile. It had not fired on anything. It had not threatened anything. It was simply going somewhere, and we happened to be between where it had come from and where it was going, and we had been logged. Logged. I thought about the survey officer, 847 years ago, who had looked at this species' military vessels from a safe distance and decided not to get closer. I thought about the decision that had been made over centuries not to resurvey, not to make contact, not to update the ledger entry. I thought about the gap in the record. I thought about what the gap had contained, growing quietly for 847 years, without our knowledge, without our classification, without our ledger. The Iridian scar was one ship. One. And it was 2.4 kilometers long, crewed by 14,000 to 19,000 people, running 47 weapons emplacements per side at ready-state maintenance charge, carrying a polished ram point and centuries of repair work, and the kind of absolute directional confidence that you only have when you know with certainty where you are going and what you will do when you arrive. One ship. At midnight, at 0 station time, 23 hours and 43 minutes after the boundary crossing, I filed the final formal entry in the incident log. The entry was, by regulation, a summary classification of the contact. I was required to assign it a status. The status options in the ledger are specific. I reviewed all of them. Resolved, not applicable. The contact had not been classified. Classification pending, already applied at the council level, not mine to refile. Threat assessed, not applicable. No hostile action had been taken. Non-threat, not applicable. The ship had ignored every territorial protocol. The absence of hostile action was not the same as the absence of significance. Under observation, this was the closest available status. It meant the contact is known, is being monitored, and has not yet been fully categorized. I applied under observation. Then, because I am a senior classification warden with 31 years of service, and I understand the ledger's limitations better than most, I added a manual annotation to the entry. Manual annotations are permitted under Regulation 14.7 of the Classification Protocols, when the supervising warden determines that existing status categories are insufficient to accurately represent the nature of the contact. The annotation read: Object ISV Iridian scar, Terran affiliation, does not conform to any existing ledger category. The contact maintained its heading and velocity through 17 hours of collective boundary space without deviation, response, or acknowledgement of collective territorial protocols. The ledger's null classification result is, in this warden's assessment, an accurate representation of the contact's nature. This object exists outside the framework of our classification system, not because our system is deficient, but because the object and everything it represents has developed without reference to our system, on a trajectory that our ledger has not tracked and cannot retroactively categorize. Status under observation is applied as the closest available designation. Recommend immediate formal contact initiative with the Terran polity. Recommend priority resurvey of all sectors adjacent to Terran space. Recommend Classification Council review of gap survey protocols to prevent recurrence of extended unmonitored development in proximate space. Note, the object is continuing on its assigned heading toward collective core space. The ledger's inability to classify it has not affected its trajectory. At 47, 11 days after the incident, the Iridian scar transmitted a third time. I was not on duty when the transmission arrived. I was in my quarters, which I had returned to after the Prime Arbiter released non-critical monitoring staff from station duty, once the contact had moved beyond our sensor range. The transmission was logged automatically and forwarded to my queue as the duty warden of record. I read it the next morning. It was brief, 3 sentences, rendered by the linguistic database in approximately the same Terran language variant as the previous 2 transmissions. Survey complete, Meridian 9 sector catalogued. Returning to base on heading 7x4 ascending. Survey complete. I read that 3 times. The Iridian scar had been conducting a survey. It had come into collective space, our space, the space we have maintained and catalogued for 4,000 years on a survey mission. It had moved through, logged what it found, and it was now going home. It had surveyed us. It had come through our space, noted our station, noted our boundary, noted our protocols, noted everything we had done and transmitted and asserted, and it had catalogued it, filed it, added it to its own record. We had spent 18 hours trying to classify it, and in those same 18 hours, it had classified us. I sat with the 3 sentences for a long time. Then I opened my duty log and wrote, Transmission logged. Object ISV Iridian scar reports survey operations complete and returning to base. Collective status, catalogued by Terran survey. I read what I had written. Catalogued by Terran survey. The Sorvith Cataloging Collective, the entity that has catalogued 4.7 trillion objects in 4,000 years, that has never encountered a contact it could not ultimately resolve, that maintains the most comprehensive record of known space in the history of the galaxy, had been catalogued. By one ship. On a passing survey. The incident review convened 37 days after the boundary crossing. I gave my testimony over 3 sessions, working from my duty log, the scan data, the transmission records, and my written account. The review panel was thorough, and the questions were good, and I answered all of them as accurately as I could. At the close of the final session, the panel chair, a classification counselor named Rethvoa Senek, who has held her position for 60 years, and who I have always regarded as one of the sharpest minds in the collective's classification service, looked at my testimony summary and said, Warden Senior Sale Thomiron, in your 31 years of service, have you ever encountered a contact that could not be classified? No, I said. And yet the Iridian scar returns a null classification. Yes. She was quiet for a moment. Is it your assessment that the null result is a failure of the ledger or a property of the object? I thought about how to answer that carefully, because I had thought about it for 37 days, and I had arrived at an answer that I believed was accurate, and I wanted to be precise. The ledger is designed, I said, to classify objects that exist within a framework it has already encountered. Its 4,000-year history gives it a very large framework. The null result does not mean the ledger failed. It means the Iridian scar exists outside the ledger's historical framework. The ship developed somewhere we were not watching, in a tradition we have no record of, over a period of time longer than our awareness of its creators. The ledger cannot classify what it has never seen. The null result is correct. She considered that, and the survey mission, their cataloging of us. Also correct, I said. We were an unknown contact in their space. They did what any competent survey operation does when it encounters an uncharted object. They classified us, she said. Yes. A pause, and their ledger, if they have one, now contains an entry for the collective. Almost certainly. The transmission language suggests a formal survey record. Whatever system they use to catalog their observations now has an entry for Meridian 9, the collective's boundary protocols, and presumably every signal we transmitted over those 18 hours. The counselor was quiet for a long time, long enough that I began to wonder if I should say something. Then she said, "The Iridian scar is one vessel." Yes. The 847-year survey note described a military fleet of unknown size. Yes. Unknown size, she repeated, the way you repeat something when the weight of it is settling into you for the first time, even though it has been in the record the whole time. Yes, I said. She looked at me, I looked at her. File your final report, she said. The council will determine next steps. I have filed my final report. I am writing this addendum now, because addenda are permitted, and because there are things I want to say that do not belong in a formal report but that I believe belong in the record. I have been a ledger warden for 31 years. My work and the work of everyone in the collective's classification service is based on a simple principle, that the universe can be known, that knowing it is possible, and that the ledger, the accumulated record of 4,000 years of careful, systematic, comprehensive observation, is a reliable map of what exists. I still believe that principle. I believe in the ledger. But I believe now, in a way I did not believe before the night of the boundary crossing, that a map is only reliable to the edges of where you have looked. Beyond those edges, the map is silent, and silence is not the same as emptiness. The Iridian scar came from the silent part of the map. It was 2.4 kilometers long and crewed by up to 19,000 people, and armed with 47 weapons emplacements per side, and it had been through enough in enough time to cover its hull in centuries of repair work and still maintain its ram point to a polish. And it was one ship. One. From a species we decided, 847 years ago, not to approach more closely. I have no way of knowing what the Iridian scar's survey found, or what conclusions the Terran polity will draw from it, or whether we will hear from them again and in what form that contact will take. The Classification Council is, I am told, preparing a formal contact initiative. I hope it succeeds. I hope it is not too late. I hope that the entry in the Terran survey record, the one that now contains our boundary station and our protocols, and our 18 hours of unanswered hails, and our failed closure protocol, and our null classification. I hope that entry reads as the record of a civilization that was simply unaware, rather than the record of one that was given the opportunity to know and chose not to take it. I hope that, at 0 station time, 38 days after the boundary crossing, I completed the final duty log entry in Meridian 9's incident record. I assigned the contact its formal status, under observation. In the ledger's 4,000-year history, that status has been applied, on average, for approximately 72 hours before a full classification resolves the entry. The Iridian scar has been under observation for 38 days. The ledger has still not produced a classification. Contact unresolvable, object persists, classification pending. The Iridian scar continues on its assigned heading. The ledger continues processing. I do not know which will finish first. I am not certain the ledger will.